Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed this wonderful lunch that was prepared for us today. Thank you all for coming. Each year when we have the John Pollock Award for Christian Biography, we like to have a little time to visit with our distinguished author, and this year authors, two of them, just to hear what they want to say about the writing of Christian biography, about this particular book, what biography is, why we should read it, and why others should write it. And so our guests this year have agreed to join us in this venture. So before we ask them to come, I'm going to recognize two people I don't think who've been introduced today, and I want you to know they're here. The first one is the wife of Dr. Mark Noll, Margaret Noll. She's here at the head table. Thank you for coming and joining us today. And seated right next to her is Mrs. Marla Courts. She, of course, is the wife of our former president, the late Dr. Tom Courts. And it was really Dr. Courts and consorting with the Divinity School and plotting together in a conspiracy to create the John Pollock Award. He introduced us to Mr. Pollock and went with us to London for the first presentation of this award, I think back in 1999. It was for the biography of the late Dr. John Stott, written by Bishop Timothy Dudley Smith. And so, Mrs. Courts, thank you for your commitment to this prize and to all you do for Samford University and Beeson Divinity School. Now, we've already introduced Dr. Mark Noll. I'm not going to repeat that now. We want to hear from Mark and from Carolyn. So would you all come and share with us whatever is in your heart to share? And then maybe if we have time, a little Q&A.
Sure. Come on, Carolyn. You're first. I'll say a word or two and then let Carolyn say whatever she'd like to say. The first thing is to say that about the authorship. Timothy George mentioned in the chapel services the first time the Pollock Award had been given to a multi-authored book. He doesn't realize how multi the authorship really was. Maggie, my wife, did a great deal of research for both myself and Carolyn. If the index is any good, it's hers to be complimented and not me to be criticized. I think it is pretty good. If you like the maps, same thing. But it even goes further than that, because this project would not have taken place had not a young editor from InterVarsity Press got me at a moment of weakness and said, you really should try to write some things about world Christianity since you're teaching courses. And I thought, well, I really don't have time, but if I get somebody to help me. And she said, oh, I think my mother-in-law would help you. So Joel Scandrett, who's Carolyn's son-in-law, is also part of the authorial team behind the curtain here.
Didn't know that.
Yes, well, things come out at these kind of meetings. Let me say just one or two matters, and then Carolyn can contribute. One is to say that this type of writing is not intensely researched, although we hope responsibly researched. We have Lyle Dorset in the crowd who knows about real research on biographies. But if we had done real research, we would have had to have been a much longer book. The figures we chose because we thought they were significant, and there was some literature available in English on them, and that they were not so well known. So figures like Watchman Nee, for example, are not in the book because he's better known. We also had originally hoped to have Latin American figures in the book, but decided not to do that because of the complexities of Christendom. President Westmoreland was complaining about the overuse of the word postmodernism during lunch, and Christendom is a word that's overused. But in simple terms, we were able to choose figures from parts of the world where Christianity was a new development, and in different ways, but each in their own way, showed something interesting and important about the places in the world where Christianity had recently come. Latin America is different. Latin America has been part of European colonization since the 16th century, and while there's all sorts of interesting ferment in Protestant circles and even some in Catholic circles, it just would have been rehashing some of the ancient Catholic-Protestant antagonisms, European colonization, and American settlement, and so we avoided that. Last thing I'd say before giving the podium to Carolyn and maybe asking for your questions is that this type of study can be not exactly disconcerting, but destabilizing. I'm a Presbyterian sort of genetically now after decades of being married to Maggie, and Presbyterians just don't jump around and don't have a lot of visions and a lot of dreams and a lot of occasions where the Lord speaks to you directly. But I think probably 3/4 of the people of this book did. Were they right? Am I right? Well, I don't know. The individuals in the book were some that were very pietistic. So one of the figures that Carolyn actually researched was Simeon Nisabambi, who was at the origins of the East African revival that had such fruitful results with the career of Janini Luam. But Simeon Nisabambi was a pure pietist. He withdrew almost completely from public life. Was this a good thing? Well, we decided it wasn't ours to judge. For this book, we were not trying to evaluate, but we were trying to expose readers in the West to some of their brothers and sisters from the majority Christian world.
I've worked as a writer for, probably 30-some years. I have to say, out of all of that, this was the most fun writing project I have ever encountered. And I've encountered some fun ones. But the joy of working with Mark and with Maggie both, Maggie was really the guts behind this in terms of finding stuff, and she's magic at it. She will just find the most obscure things and probably be online to some neighboring librarian, and it's in front of me before I even knew I needed it. And that was really a huge help to me. But to be able to explore these names, we started out with something like 100 names that would be potentially people we could enjoy writing about. And they were spread out all over Mark and Maggie's dining room table, and we started cutting them down to something that was manageable, using some of the standards that Mark just mentioned. You know, can we get resources about them in English? Are they, in fact, impactful, even though we haven't heard a lot of them? Has everything been said that needs to be said about this character? We'll take that one off. So we deliberately chose some of the lesser known, and then kind of started spreading out the geography and the impact impact that they had. But then after that, it was almost like detective work, because some of them were so obscure that it was very hard. You know, with Maggie's help, we could find stuff, but then I was always looking for motives and influences and what happened next for this or that character. And it was sort of like creating your own detective novel, only doing it in about, 4,000 words with limited resources and having to document every single thing. But it was a ton of fun. And, of course, working with stellar scholars and friends was a great joy. So it's good to be here together.
Do you have any questions? I have one or two, but let's open it up.
You have written a biography. The Pollock Award is for biographies, and I would pose this to the Dean as well. Maybe you could reflect on how biographies have functioned in the history of the church for one's formation, one's sense of Christian identity, and maybe name a few of the most significant biographies that you think would fit in that category down through the ages. I would refer to the historian.
I would defer to the historian as well.
I think this is actually a more sensitive question than it seems, because of the temptation, I think, in the Christian circles to make figures of biography into perfect Christians, of which there are none. This, I think, I'd like to hear Timothy talk about this, because I, for a long time, was turned off of Christian biography because I read so many when I was a young person, and at some properly revolting adolescent stage, I came to the conclusion that they were all phony, the biographies, not necessarily the people, because you never heard about sinfulness, you never heard about selfishness. The people were perfect. And of course, all Christian traditions know that people aren't perfect. Some are redeemed, but but that's quite different. In the history of Christianity, there is a history of hagiography, the history of saints, which is somewhat different because hagiography is a genre that is intended to be exemplary and not necessarily realistic. My problems were with modern biographies that were supposed to be realistic and weren't. Hagiography certainly was a great teaching tool. Biography remains a great teaching tool. Biographies have narratives. A person who's selected for a biographical subject usually has some intrinsic interest. The task of an author is to do the research, write the narrative as cleanly and clearly as possible, and get out of the way, because you want the people to be that are being written about to challenge you. I would say, and I think Carolyn would agree with me, that getting into some of these lives that were oriented outside of our normal Western conventions was greatly instructive. Most, I would say, in terms of the simple Christian virtues, not the heroic Christian virtues. So, luum, choosing to room with an ordinary pastor, or Bernard Maziki, who we opened the book with, I think, who comes from Portuguese East Africa to South Africa, and his teachers think he's a dimwit because he's so quiet. And then within 3 or 4 years, he is speaking several African languages: Portuguese, French, Afrikaans, English, and the missionaries are marveling at the speed with which he's picked up the languages. And there doesn't appear to be any resentment, any antagonism, any post-colonial angst in Maziki's character. Of significant biographies, I mean, I would be interested in what Carolyn had to say about people. She's going to talk in the class, in Professor Sellis's class tomorrow, a little bit about what she learned from autobiography and biographies. But I certainly was myself attracted to the formal study of the history of Christianity, mostly through reading biographies of Reformation figures. The great biography of Martin Luther by Roland Bainton, tremendous set of biographies of 16th century worthies by Ridley, by Jasper Ridley. The biographies of Calvin are never as exciting because they're all about what he wrote and preached. But they too, some of those are very, very good. But I do think Protestants, sometimes Reformed Protestants, Reformation Protestants, do over-hagiographize. George Marsden's wonderful biography of Jonathan Edwards, in some places I think came too close to presenting a flawless Edwards, although in other places did not, in a terrific study. But this is a problem. Biography has to be realistic, but then also has to be, for Christian purposes, edifying purposes, to honor God. And I think keeping those two things in tension is a real trick.
He said it.
I became a historian because when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I went to the public library and checked out one summer 50 biographies written for little kids, about all the great figures in history. And I just, wow, this is fascinating stuff. Now, I would say, Mark mentioned Roland Bainton, who was one of the great historians of our modern era, and a wonderful storyteller. That's the great, I think, gift of being a great biographer, is you can tell, you've got a good story and you can tell it well. Or if you have a bad story, at least tell it in a way that doesn't match your character. So Roland Bainton did that. I would mention another biography of Luther that I would rank maybe a little higher than Bainton. It's a different kind of biography. It's by Heiko Obermann, called Luther, Man Between Death and the Devil. It's a wonderful story contextualizing Luther, bringing out things you don't often see. The only real biography I've written is a biography of William Carey, which I was asked to do several years ago. And I found while writing that and interacting with that life story, which is easy to turn into hagiography. He's one of the father of modern missions, great, flawless. But of course, he had lots of flaws. And I found the flaws in Carey, not so much reading what the great biographers had said about him, but by reading his own letters and his own journals. And there it comes through. Here was a man who struggled with depression. Here was a man who didn't maybe always treat his first wife. He had 3, not at once, but 3. But he didn't treat his first wife, Dorothy, in an exemplary way. I don't think he was a model husband. But somehow, in spite and through those flaws, even character flaws maybe, God was able to use him and his life shines today. So dig deeper than the surface, and you'll find almost, even maybe in Jonathan Edwards, though it's hard to find in him, some rubs and flaws. That's all I would say. Other questions? Comments?
Timothy, I can add what I should have said earlier, but another very interesting part of the research is that we were actually privileged to be helped on some of these figures by very old people who had done some of the original research. One of our characters is John Chalembwe, who, if you lived in the country of Malawi, you could see on the postage stamps, but had been a preacher who'd come actually and done a degree at an African-American Baptist seminary in the United States, but who then went back to what was then not called Malawi, but Nyasaland, and was killed by the British in a rebellion in 1915. George Shepperson had written a biography of him in the 60s. It was very well done, and we found out that he was alive. So we wrote to him, and he sent him the chapter, and he sent back his comments. The biographer of William Wade Harris turned out to be living in a Mennonite retirement village just 30 miles from us. So we got to visit him. He subsequently passed away, but he had his massive dissertation that he'd done for Andrew Walls on Harris, and he was the world's living expert. We got letters from our one Korean subject, Sun Keel, from Samuel Moffat, whose father had been the seminary pastor of this person in our book. And Samuel Moffat is himself well into his 90s now, but he and his wife were able to send us some documents. So it was a great experience to be living the communion of faith in the academic world while trying to write about the communion of faith in our biographical studies. Yes, tell me the clue.
Yeah, could add to that Byung Katoh, who died very young, age 39. But in the opening scene of the biography of that, a person named Jim Pluteman is in that scene, and it's full of a bit more detail than you would normally find in a history book because we got the stories directly from Jim. And it was his first term of mission work in Africa. And he said, Byung Katoh was my best friend. And Byung was his boss, his African boss, and died tragically. And that, of all of the chapters, Jim himself cautioned me, don't fall into hagiography on that. Don't make him too pretty. But it's hard to do that with a person who died at age 39 and was someone's best friend. So,
Betsy.
Are there any glaring holes that you see out there, people whose biographies need to be written that there haven't been good biographies of? People that you hope to write about in the future?
Well, not necessarily that I hope to write about in the future, but certainly among the most interesting things to work on were the Chinese biographies. And the ones we had were people all who, to one degree or another, were known, although there's an interesting story there, too. One of the people we wrote about was John Sung, maybe Carolyn can give us the Chinese name, I forget what it was, but who was famous and actually renowned in both Chinese and American circles because of his pedigree. He came from China to a small college in Ohio, I think, Ohio Wesleyan or something, sponsored by Methodist missionaries, was a whiz at chemistry, went on to do a PhD in chemistry, and then was turned to the ministry, went to study at Union Seminary in New York, and has the story and presented the story in 3 or 4 autobiographies of how he was turned off by the liberal theology, the callousness of the Union Seminary faculty in the early 30s, and went back to China to be an evangelist, and on his way back to China threw his PhD diploma over the side of the boat, and then was known as, Billy Sunday was kind of like the tamest college professor you've ever heard compared to John Sung, who was he was an activist in the pulpit. Well, it turns out that after we published the book, we heard from a young man who's doing a PhD dissertation with Dana Robert at Boston University, and Dana is the one person in the country who really helped this kind of study for decades at Boston University. This young man has actually found the documents at Union Seminary having to do with John Sung, and John Sung simply had it wrong. He was helped out extensively by the Union seminary people. They raised money for him. They intervened with the mental hospital where he stayed. They went out of their way to try to see him centered in his own personal life and his own Christian life. And you get a very different picture of Union Seminary in the age of Reinhold Niebuhr in the early 1930s from the documentation. But this was a case where the hagiography of this great evangelist, and he was a great evangelist. Our friend Daniel Bays, who's worked on the history of Christianity in China all his life, says probably there were more individuals converted and long-lasting Protestants in the 30s and 40s in China from the ministry of this one individual than anyone else. But he had forgotten or fabricated or lied about some of the things that happened to him in the United States. So a lot of Chinese people, Betsy, for which the documentation, a lot of these would be heroic people. I mean, we've got some of that in the book, but it's, the research is going to be difficult. Carolyn?
There's a whole area that we didn't address, and I keep kind of in the back of my mind wishing we could do more with, and that's that whole thing of what's the development of Christianity in Latin America. And there are some wonderful heroes of faith there, both Protestant and Catholic. And then you wind up with the tension between the two because they hated each other so much. It's an open challenge out there for somebody to do something with, but I think that could be a lot of fun, too.
I would just also say in the theme of the martyrdom today that what Alexander Solzhenitsyn did in the Gulag Archipelago was to record records of people from the camps, but it's on the record the number of Orthodox bishops and the thousands of Orthodox priests who were killed or imprisoned, and virtually without a record, just because the records were destroyed. And people who were able to master Russian and some of the local Soviet languages could maybe write stunningly effective biographies.
One of the winners of the Pollock Award was about Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
Right,
Yeah. And so it's a wonderful character. We have maybe time for just one or two more questions, and we'll draw this period to a close. We have other assignments for our guests this afternoon. Dr. Lyle Dorsett has already been recognized as an outstanding Christian biographer in our own midst. That means you're never eligible to win the John Pollock Award, Dr. Dorsett. I'm sorry to disappoint you. But do you have any thoughts about the writing of biography, since you've done that so well for a long time?
Well, I don't know that I have any particular thoughts other than that I know that Mark Noll, who was my colleague at Wheaton, helped me think differently about Christian biography than I did when I first tackled it. I don't think I ever slipped into hagiography because I'm such a flawed guy. I look for flaws in other people. It gives me hope and encouragement. But I remember when I did a little biography of E.M. Bounds, Mark said to me in his inimitable way, "When are you going to write some real history again?" And I, because I respect him so much, I took that away, and I realized that, and I talk about some flaws of Bounds, but I spent too much time trying to explain exactly how God worked in his life and things like that. I think I'm very distressed with people who let everyone else in the world run the flag up for what they believe and what they say, even be advocates for those things, but Christians aren't allowed to do it when they write a book. But on the other hand, we can go too far in the other way, where we can't speak to a wider audience, and that becomes a great danger. So I sit here today and thank you, Mark, for some things I've done since then. I tried to speak to a little wider audience because you had you thought too highly of me and the craft to just let it pass.
That's a great comment. I would say, just a personal response, that I think you have learned that lesson. If your biography of A.W. Tozier is any indication, he comes across as a very great man, but also a deeply flawed man in your writing of his life. So Thank you for that. Someone else. One final question, maybe. Well, let me ask one final question, and it's kind of picking up on what Carolyn was saying just a moment ago about the martyrs of South America, both Catholics and Protestants, evangelicals. And Mark alluded earlier the whole problem of writing about that from the standpoint of the divided Christendom. But in John Paul II's great encyclical on Christian unity, That They All May Be One, he ends that by appealing to martyrs and saying this is a part of our common patrimony, our common heritage as believers in Jesus Christ. And that even in Rome, not so long ago, the Pope led a procession to the Colosseum in which a number of Protestant martyrs were recognized alongside Catholic martyrs, including one Baptist martyr from Canada who was put to death in Latin America. So maybe the study of the martyrs of the faith can be a ground of our coming together as believers in Christ across these different confessions without asking anybody to compromise our deep convictions. That's not the purpose of it, but to see how God has spoken in different ways in moments of great suffering and duress to those who were faithful unto death. So on behalf of all of us, let me thank Carolyn and Mark for being here today and for this conversation. Thank you so much.